Welcome to Cryptid Monologues. Let's dive into a world where myths meet imagination. Here we unravel chilling tales of cryptids, Bigfoot, Wendigos, dogmen, skinwalkers, and more. These stories are crafted to ignite your imagination. These stories are purely fictitious, and names and/or events are purely coincidental. If you like these kind of stories, please give a like and subscribe. Click on the notification bell to stay up to date. Thanks for listening. Let's get into it. The Long Trail North. The year was 1882, and the plains of Texas stretched endlessly under a blazing sun. Dust rose in thick clouds around the cowhands, mingling with the rhythmic clatter of hooves as the herd pressed onward. Over 2,000 longhorns, lean and tough, were bound for the fertile grazing lands of Montana, a journey of over 1,500 miles that would test man and beast alike. Leading the drive was Jack Sutton, a seasoned trail boss with a face as weathered as the saddle he'd ridden for 2 decades. At 35, he was already a legend on the Chisholm Trail, known for his sharp instincts and steady hand in a stampede. By his side was young Will Tucker, a wiry 18-year-old on his first drive. Will had signed on at a ranch outside Abilene, eager to prove himself under Sutton's command. "You keep your eyes open, kid," Jack had told him on the first day. "This ain't just a ride, it's a fight against everything that can go wrong." And Jack was right. Chapter 1. The Gathering in Texas. It was late March, and the spring rains had softened the dusty plains of West Texas. The Sutton Ranch was a bustling hive of activity as men, horses, and cattle prepared for the long trek north. Jack Sutton stood on the weathered porch of the ranch house, his piercing gray eyes scanning the scene. The drive wasn't just business, it was survival. Montana's open grasslands had become a haven for ranchers willing to brave the dangers of the trail. Beef prices were climbing in the northern territories, and Jack knew this drive could secure his ranch for years to come. "Got the tally yet?" he called to Jed Hawkins, his foreman and trusted right-hand man. Jed, a burly man with a perpetual scowl, tipped his hat back and waved a notebook. "Just shy of 2,100 head. All branded and ready to go." Jack nodded. "Good, let's keep it that way. Last thing we need is to lose stock before we even get out of Texas." Behind him, the ranch house door creaked open, and a boy stepped out. Will Tucker, wiry and wide-eyed, had arrived a week earlier, eager to join the drive. His boots were new, his hat too clean, and the faint tremor in his hands betrayed his inexperience. "Morning, boss," Will said, straightening his hat nervously. Jack eyed him critically. "Morning. You ever ride herd before, Tucker?" "No, sir," Will admitted, his voice steady despite the flush creeping up his neck. "But I can ride, and I'm a quick learner." Jack studied him for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "We'll see. Stick close to Jed for now. You keep up, you'll earn your keep." Will nodded eagerly and hurried off to saddle his horse, determination written all over his face. The crew was a mix of seasoned cowhands and fresh faces like Will. There was Charlie Boone, the jovial cook who somehow managed to make hearty meals out of dried beans and salt pork. His chuck wagon, stocked with coffee, flour, and bacon, was as essential as the horses. Then there was Matt Rivera, a quiet but deadly accurate shot who'd grown up on the Mexican borderlands. He was the kind of man you wanted on your side in a fight, and his calm demeanor had a way of steadying even the most skittish cowhands. Hank Garrison, an older cowboy with a grizzled beard and 1,000 stories, took it upon himself to look after Will. "Trail's no place for a boy," Hank grumbled to Jack, "but I'll make sure he don't get himself killed." As the sun dipped low, casting the horizon in hues of gold and red, the cowhands worked to round up the herd. The low, guttural calls of the longhorns mingled with the crack of whips and shouts of the men. Chapter 2. The Departure. At dawn, the drive began. Jack rode ahead, his horse Dusty, moving with an easy grace that came from years on the trail. Jed and Matt flanked the herd, keeping the longhorns in check, while Will and Hank brought up the rear. The first few days were uneventful but grueling. The terrain was flat, the weather mild, but the monotony of the trail began to wear on the less experienced cowhands. The herd moved slowly, grazing as they walked, and every man knew the real challenges lay ahead. One evening, as the crew gathered around the campfire, Hank leaned back against his saddle and eyed Will. "You holding up, kid?" Will nodded, though his face was pale and his hands were blistered from gripping the reins all day. "It's harder than I thought," he admitted, staring into the flames. Hank chuckled. "It ain't no picnic, that's for sure, but you'll toughen up. Long as you don't lose your nerve, you'll make it." Jack, who'd been sitting nearby sharpening a knife, glanced at Will. "He's right. This life ain't for the faint of heart. You're either in it for the long haul, or you're not." Will straightened, the firelight catching the determination in his eyes. "I'm in it." Jack gave a small nod of approval and returned to his task. As they crossed into Indian territory, Jack felt the weight of the trail grow heavier. The vast plains seemed peaceful, but he knew better. The open land held dangers, sudden storms, rustlers, and the ever-present threat of stampede. One evening, Matt returned to camp after scouting ahead, his expression grim. "There's fresh tracks," he said, dropping to a crouch near the fire. "Looks like a small group of riders, maybe 5 or 6. Could be rustlers." Jack frowned, his jaw tightening. "How far?" "Maybe 10 miles east. They're not following us, but they're close enough to be trouble." Jack nodded, his mind already calculating. "We'll double the night watch. Keep the herd close. If they're looking for trouble, we'll make 'em think twice." As the men settled in for the night, Will found himself on watch with Hank. The older cowboy pointed to the horizon, where the last traces of daylight faded into darkness. "Out here, you keep your eyes open, kid," Hank said, his voice low. "The trail's got a way of testing you when you least expect it." Will nodded, gripping his rifle tightly. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to face it. The night was unusually quiet. The usual hum of insects and soft rustling of the prairie grass seemed muted under the weight of the vast Texas sky. Will Tucker sat near the edge of the camp, rifle resting across his lap, his eyes darting between the grazing herd and the dark horizon. Hank Garrison, his watch partner, leaned against a saddle, smoking his pipe. "Stay sharp," Hank muttered, blowing out a thin stream of smoke. "Quiet like this can mean trouble." Will nodded, his grip tightening on the rifle. The earlier report of tracks from Mateo Rivera lingered in his mind. Who were those riders? Rustlers? Or worse? The answer came sooner than he expected. In the stillness of the night, Will caught the faint sound of hoofbeats. He straightened, his heart pounding. Hank heard it too, snuffing out his pipe and rising to his feet. "Riders," Hank whispered. The 2 men scanned the horizon, and then they saw them, 5 figures emerging from the darkness, their horses moving at a deliberate pace. The firelight flickered off their silhouettes, revealing the unmistakable shapes of feathered headdresses and long rifles. "Natives," Hank muttered under his breath. Chapter 3. A Tense Arrival. Jack Sutton and Mateo were already awake, alerted by the soft calls of the approaching riders. Jack stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Easy, boys," he said calmly to the men who had roused from their bedrolls, rifles in hand. "Let's not start anything we don't need to finish." The quiet of the night seemed to deepen as the 5 Comanche riders approached the camp. Their movements were deliberate, their presence commanding. Jack Sutton stepped forward, his revolver resting in its holster, his hand loose but ready. The leader of the Comanche dismounted, his tall frame outlined by the glow of the campfire. His face was solemn, his eyes scanning the herd and the men with sharp precision. Jack offered a small nod of respect. "Evening," Jack began. "We mean no harm." Just passing through on a cattle drive to Montana. The leader said nothing at first, studying Jack before gesturing to the men around the fire. He spoke in a low, steady tone, his words rolling like distant thunder. Mateo Rivera, who'd grown up speaking the Comanche tongue, stepped forward to translate. He says they've been watching us for 2 days. They know we haven't stolen from their land. Jack inclined his head. We respect your territory. What brings you here tonight? Mateo hesitated as the leader spoke again, his voice carrying a note of urgency. Finally, Mateo turned to Jack, his expression grim. He says we need to be careful. Not because of rustlers, but because of the hairy man. The camp fell silent as Mateo relayed the Comanche leader's words. The leader continued, gesturing to the dark prairie beyond the firelight. The hairy man is a spirit, Mateo translated. It roams the land, watching and waiting. It lives deep in the hills and forests, but it hunts at night. Cattle are not its only prey. It hungers for men who stray too far from their fire. Will Tucker felt a shiver run down his spine. He glanced at Hank Garrison, who was listening intently, his weathered face betraying no fear but plenty of caution. What does he mean by hairy man? Jack asked, his voice calm but curious. Mateo hesitated, then spoke carefully. The Comanche call it Maikwati. It's a creature, part man, part beast, taller than any man, covered in hair, with eyes that burn like embers. They say it's as strong as a bear and faster than a horse, and it's not just a story. His people have seen it. Jack's eyes narrowed. What does it want? The leader spoke again, his tone heavier this time. Mateo's voice dropped as he translated. He says it takes what it wants. Sometimes cattle, sometimes men. It doesn't need a reason, it just does. The leader gestured toward the herd, then pointed to the men sitting around the fire. His gaze lingered on Will, as though sensing the young cowboy's unease. Mateo's voice grew quieter. He says it has been seen recently, near this trail. His people have found tracks, large ones, too large for any man and too far from water to be a bear. He says the hairy man is watching. It's always watching. The words settled over the camp like a heavy blanket. The crackling fire seemed louder in the silence that followed. Jack met the leader's gaze and nodded solemnly. We appreciate the warning. We'll keep our herd close and our men closer. The Comanche leader nodded, then spoke one last time before mounting his horse. Mateo translated, Stay together, don't wander into the trees, and when you hear it, if you hear it, do not follow the sound. The riders turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving the cowhands with the uneasy realization that the trail's dangers were not just of man and nature, but something far older and stranger. As the camp settled back into an uneasy quiet, Will couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The vast expanse of prairie suddenly felt too open, too vulnerable. What do you think they meant? Will asked Hank as they resumed their night watch. Hank adjusted his hat and stared into the darkness. Could be they're just trying to spook us. But then again, the Comanche don't make up stories just to pass the time. Will swallowed hard. You ever hear of something like that? A hairy man? Hank's jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't answer. Finally he said, Once, a long time ago, up in the hills near Arkansas. Didn't see it myself, but some old-timers swore by it. Said there were things out there man wasn't meant to understand. The wind picked up, rustling the grass and carrying the distant lowing of the herd. Will gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles white. Chapter 4. The First Signs. The next morning, as the drive pushed onward, the cowhands couldn't shake the unease left by the Comanche's warning. Jack and Mateo rode ahead, scouting for water, while the rest of the crew managed the herd. It wasn't long before they found something strange. Jack, over here! Jed Hawkins called, waving them over to a patch of ground near a grove of cottonwoods. Jack dismounted and crouched beside Jed, his eyes narrowing. In the soft earth was a single track, massive, with toes that splayed wide like a man's but far larger. That ain't no bear, Jed muttered. No, Jack agreed, his voice low. It isn't. The men exchanged uneasy glances, the Comanche's warning echoing in their minds. Whatever, the track lingered in Jack Sutton's mind long after they left the cottonwood grove behind. He didn't mention it to the men, but word had spread anyway. Cowboys whispered to one another while riding the herd, their eyes darting to the surrounding plains as though the creature might materialize at any moment. Will Tucker rode near Hank Garrison, his gaze sweeping the horizon. Do you think that track was real? I mean, nothing that big could just walk around out here without someone seeing it, right? Hank chewed on a blade of grass, his face impassive. Real enough for the Comanche to warn us, real enough for Jack not to laugh it off. He spat and adjusted his hat. Best you keep your wits about you, kid. Real or not, something made that print, and we don't want to find out the hard way. It was clear the trail north had more in store than just rustlers and storms. That evening, the crew set up camp near a shallow stream. The cattle drank nervously, their ears flicking at sounds too faint for the cowhands to notice. The men spoke little over dinner, their usual banter replaced by quiet glances into the darkening prairie. Jack ordered triple watches that night. 2 men on the herd, 2 on the camp, he said firmly. Nobody rides off alone. If you hear anything strange, you wake the others. Don't investigate on your own. As the men nodded and prepared for bed, the night closed in around them. The firelight felt feeble against the vast expanse of the plains. Will was paired with Hank for the second watch. They sat near the edge of the camp, their rifles resting across their laps. The prairie seemed too quiet, no coyotes, no rustling grass. You hear that? Will asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Hank tilted his head, listening. Ain't nothing to hear, he muttered, though his grip on the rifle tightened. That's what's got me spooked. Then, faintly, it came, a low, guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a moan. It rose and fell like the wind, but there was a weight to it that made Will's stomach churn. What is that? He whispered, his heart pounding. Hank's face was pale in the moonlight. Don't know, but we ain't gonna find out. Keep your eyes on the herd. The sound came again, closer this time. The cattle stirred uneasily, their lowing growing louder as they clustered together. One steer bolted, and Hank stood, raising his voice. Easy now, don't let 'em spook. The sound stopped as abruptly as it started, leaving the camp in an eerie silence. At first light, Jack and Jed rode out to check the area. Mateo and 2 others joined them, their rifles ready. Will and Hank stayed back to tend the herd, but Will couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The scouting party returned an hour later, their faces grim. Jack dismounted and called the men together. We found more tracks, he said, his voice steady but low. Bigger than the one yesterday. There were broken branches, too, up high, like something tall was moving through the trees. Whatever it is, it's following us. A murmur rippled through the crew. Charlie Boone, the cook, crossed himself. You reckon it's that hairy man the Comanche talked about? I don't know, Jack admitted, but I know we're not stopping. We keep the herd moving, and we stay sharp. No one goes off alone, and no one ignores the watch orders. Over the next few days, the signs grew harder to ignore. More tracks appeared along their route, always just far enough from the herd to avoid detection during the day. At night, the strange guttural sounds returned, sometimes distant, sometimes so close that even the cattle froze, their eyes wide with fear. Will began to feel the weight of the trail in a way he hadn't before. The long days of riding and the sleepless nights wore on him, but it was the oppressive sense of being watched that gnawed at his nerves. One evening, Mateo caught him staring at the horizon, his face pale. You're thinking about it, aren't you? Mateo asked. Will nodded. I can't help it. What if it's real? What if it's out there, watching us right now? Mateo smiled faintly, though his eyes remained serious. It's out there, sure enough, but so are we. Remember, Will, the trail's always dangerous, one way or another. You can't let fear stop you from riding forward. That night, the camp was restless. The fire burned brighter than usual, piled high with wood in an unspoken attempt to keep the darkness at bay. As the men tried to sleep, a loud crash echoed through the stillness. Jack was on his feet in an instant, his revolver drawn. "Jed, what was that?" Jed, who'd been on watch, pointed to the edge of the camp where a tree had fallen. Its trunk was splintered in a way that didn't look natural. "It wasn't the wind," Jed said grimly. "Whatever pushed that over is strong." The men exchanged uneasy glances, and Jack tightened his grip on his revolver. "All right, boys, looks like tonight's going to be a long one." As the men took their positions around the camp, the night seemed to close in tighter than ever. Somewhere in the darkness, the low growl began again. This time, it didn't stop. Chapter 5: A Glimpse in the Night. The low growl echoed through the camp, sending a shiver down the spines of every man. The fire crackled weakly, its flames barely illuminating the surrounding darkness. The cattle shifted uneasily, their nervous lowing breaking the stillness. Jack tightened his grip on his revolver, scanning the tree line. "Stay sharp, boys," he called out, his voice steady but low. "Whatever it is, it's out there." Will and Hank stood side by side, rifles ready. Will's hands were shaking, but Hank placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Steady, kid," Hank whispered. "Fear'll make you shoot before you're ready." Then it came, a sudden, violent crash from the far side of the herd. The cattle bellowed in panic, their hooves pounding the earth as they surged together. "Hold the herd!" Jack shouted, running toward the commotion. Mateo and Jed were already there, rifles raised, their lanterns casting shaky beams of light into the chaos. The men caught a glimpse of something massive moving just beyond the circle of light, taller than a man, with broad shoulders and a hulking silhouette. It moved with startling speed, vanishing into the trees before anyone could react. "What was that?" Jed hissed, his voice trembling. Mateo shook his head, his lantern swinging wildly. "I don't know, but it's fast and big." Jack cursed under his breath. "Everyone stay together. No one goes into the trees." The rest of the night was tense. The strange growling continued, moving around the perimeter of the camp, keeping the men on edge. Whatever was out there didn't attack again, but it didn't leave either. When dawn finally broke, the camp was a somber scene. The men looked exhausted, their faces pale from the sleepless night. Jack gathered them for a quick count of the cattle. "Let's make sure the herd's intact before we move," he said, his voice tight. As the men began checking the herd, a shout rang out. "Jack, over here!" It was Jed, standing near the edge of the grazing area, his face pale. Jack, Mateo, and Will rushed over, rifles in hand. What they found made their stomachs churn. A cow lay sprawled on the ground, its body torn open. The carcass was mutilated in a way none of them had ever seen. Deep gashes that looked more like claws than knives, and the head twisted at an unnatural angle. "Good Lord," Will whispered, his voice barely audible. Mateo crouched near the carcass, his expression grim. "This wasn't rustlers. No man could do this." Jack nodded, his face set. "It's that thing, the hairy man." Hank ran a hand through his hair, his usual calm shaken. "It's toying with us, watching us, waiting to see what we'll do next." Jack stood, his jaw clenched. "Well, we're not giving it what it wants. We move the herd today, double time. We stick together, keep the fire high at night, and stay armed." As the drive pushed onward, the mutilated cow weighed heavily on the crew. The men worked in tense silence, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon and the tree line. Will couldn't stop replaying the night in his mind. The hulking shadow, the guttural growls, the cow's mangled body. He rode alongside Hank, who seemed unusually quiet. "You think we're in over our heads?" Will finally asked. Hank sighed, adjusting his hat. "This trail's always been dangerous. Storms, rustlers, snakes. You take your chances every time you set out. But this is something else." That night, the men set up camp in a wide open area, hoping the lack of trees would give them an advantage. The fire was piled high, casting long shadows across the prairie. Jack addressed the men as they huddled around the flames. "We've got a long way to Montana, and whatever this thing is, it's not going to scare us off. We stick together, we stay alert, and we get the job done. Understood?" The men nodded, their resolve strengthened by Jack's steady leadership. But as the fire crackled and the night closed in, Will couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still watching, waiting for its next move. The days passed with a strange rhythm. The cattle plodded forward, their lowing subdued, their movements more skittish than usual. The men kept a tight formation around the herd, their rifles always within reach. Each night, the signs of the creature grew bolder. Tracks circled the camp, larger and more frequent. The strange guttural growl became a nightly presence, sometimes so close it seemed the beast was just beyond the firelight. Despite Jack's calm authority, the strain on the crew was beginning to show. "Reckon this thing's just toying with us," Jed muttered one evening as he helped Will stack more wood on the fire. Will glanced at the older man, his jaw tight. "What do you mean?" Jed spat into the dirt, his eyes on the distant tree line. "It could have hit us hard that first night. Took one of us, maybe the herd, but it didn't. It's messing with our heads, making us jump at shadows." Will swallowed hard, the image of the mutilated cow flashing in his mind. "Why would it do that?" Jed shrugged, his voice lowering. "Maybe it's curious, or maybe it's just mean." The next morning, while scouting ahead of the main group, Mateo and Hank came upon a large, ancient oak tree standing alone in the middle of the plains. Its trunk was hollowed out, a jagged opening that gaped like a mouth. "Tracks," Mateo said, pointing to the dirt around the base. Hank dismounted, his rifle at the ready. The tracks were fresh, impossibly large, and led directly to the tree. As he stepped closer, the smell hit him, a foul, musky odor that made him gag. "You smell that?" Hank said, covering his nose with a bandana. Mateo nodded, his face pale. "It's like wet fur and death." Cautiously, Hank peered into the hollow. Inside, tangled in the darkness, was a collection of bones. Some animal, some disturbingly human-looking. Hank stepped back, his heart pounding. "We found its den." Mateo's eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. "If this is where it's been, it's not far from us. We need to move." That evening, a storm rolled in, the kind that seemed to come out of nowhere on the open plains. Lightning split the sky, casting stark shadows over the camp, and the wind howled like a living thing. Jack ordered the men to keep the herd close and the fire blazing despite the rain. "No one goes more than 50 paces from camp," he barked. "We're not losing anyone to the weather or anything else." The storm raged through the night, but even over the sound of the wind and thunder, the men heard it, a deep guttural howl that rose above the chaos. Will froze, his rifle clutched tightly. "Did you hear that?" Hank, standing beside him, nodded grimly. "Loud and clear." The howl came again, closer this time, and then another sound, a heavy thud, like something massive landing on the ground. The cattle erupted into a frenzy, their terrified bellows echoing through the storm. "Get the herd under control," Jack shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. Will and Hank ran toward the edge of the camp, where the herd was clustering together in blind panic. A flash of lightning lit up the scene, and for a brief moment they saw it, a massive figure, hunched and hairy, its eyes reflecting the light like burning coals. Will's breath caught in his throat. "There it is!" Hank raised his rifle, but by the time he fired, the creature was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Chapter 6. The morning after the storm had passed by dawn, leaving the camp soaked and battered. The men were haggard, their nerves frayed after the long, sleepless night. Jack did a quick count of the herd. "We've lost a few steers," he said, his voice heavy. "Not as bad as it could have been." But Mateo came running from the far side of the grazing area, his face pale. "Jack, you need to see this." The men gathered around another carcass, a young steer, its body mutilated even worse than the first. The ground around it was churned up, the tracks impossibly large and deep. "What in God's name is it doing?" Jed asked, his voice trembling. Jack shook his head, his jaw clenched. "It's sending a message. It wants us to know it's here and that it can take what it wants." As the men stood around the grisly scene, a distant sound reached their ears. It was a deep, resonant howl, carrying over the plains like a warning. The men froze, their eyes scanning the horizon. "It's watching us," Mateo said quietly. Jack turned to his crew, his face grim but determined. "We keep moving. This thing wants us scared, wants us to run, but we've got a job to do and we're not turning back." Will swallowed hard, the image of the creature's burning eyes still seared into his mind. "And if it doesn't let us go," Jack's eyes were cold and steady, "then we make a stand." The heavy spring rains had turned the trail into a mire, the earth clinging to the hooves of the cattle and dragging at the wheels of the supply wagons. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and damp leather, and the constant drizzle left the men soaked and irritable. "Springtime on the plains," Jack muttered to Jed as they rode ahead of the herd, scouting the route. "Always a fine mess." "Better than a dry summer," Jed replied, though his tone was weary. He pointed toward the horizon, where the gray sky seemed to blend with the distant hills. "The Platts ahead should be swollen by now." Jack nodded grimly. He'd seen rivers like the Platte after the rains, wide, churning, and deceptively fast. Crossing it with 2,100 head of cattle would be no small task. When they reached the river, the sight stopped the crew in their tracks. The Platte was a torrent, its muddy waters rushing past with a roar that drowned out all other sounds. Driftwood and debris swirled in the current, some pieces large enough to smash a steer's legs if they hit wrong. Will stared at the river, his stomach sinking. "How are we supposed to get the herd across that?" Jack dismounted and stood at the water's edge, studying the flow. The river was wider than usual, its banks swollen and slick with mud. "We don't have a choice," he said, his voice steady. "There's no way around and we can't stay here. The longer we wait, the worse it'll get." Mateo frowned, his eyes narrowing at the churning water. "We'll need a good plan. Lose a few cattle to the current and the rest could stampede." The men worked quickly, securing ropes to guide the wagons and identifying the least treacherous section of the riverbank. Mateo and Hank took a small group of riders across first, testing the depth and the strength of the current. "It's bad," Mateo reported when they returned, their horses snorting and trembling. "But it's passable if we keep the herd tight and move fast," Jack nodded. "All right, Mateo, you and Hank take point. Jed and Will, you'll ride the flanks. Keep them moving, and don't let any stragglers fall behind." Will swallowed hard, gripping his reins tightly. The thought of guiding terrified cattle through the river was enough to make his hands shake, but he nodded. "Got it." The first wave of cattle stepped reluctantly into the water, their hooves sinking into the mud. The cowboys shouted and cracked their whips, urging them forward. The lead steers plunged into the current, their bodies bobbing as they fought to keep their footing. The river swallowed them almost to their shoulders, and the herd bellowed in fear. The current tugged at them, threatening to sweep the weaker animals downstream. "Keep 'em moving," Jack shouted from the rear, his voice barely audible over the roar of the water. Will rode along the edge of the herd, shouting encouragement to the men and the cattle alike. His heart pounded as he watched a young steer lose its footing, its legs flailing as the current pulled it away. "I got it!" Hank yelled, spurring his horse into the water. He lashed a rope around the steer's neck and hauled it back toward the herd, his horse straining against the current. Halfway across, the herd faltered. The lead cattle hesitated as the current grew stronger, their instinct to survive battling their fear of the unknown. The hesitation rippled through the herd, causing the rear to bunch up and push forward in panic. "They're spookin'," Mateo shouted, riding hard to keep the flank steady. Jack cracked his whip, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Keep 'em moving. Don't let 'em stop." Then disaster struck. A massive log hurtled down the river, slamming into the middle of the herd. Cattle scattered, their terrified bellows filling the air. The log struck a steer, flipping it over and dragging it under. Will's horse reared, and he fought to regain control as a wave of panicked cattle surged toward him. "Hold steady," he shouted, though his voice wavered. The chaos threatened to spiral out of control, but Jack's sharp commands and the men's quick thinking turned the tide. Mateo and Hank rode hard, their ropes keeping the herd from splitting entirely. Jed and Will worked the flanks, guiding stragglers back toward the main group. The men were soaked to the bone, their arms aching from the effort, but slowly the herd began to move forward again. When the last of the cattle climbed onto the far bank, the men collapsed onto the muddy ground, their breaths coming in gasps. The herd was battered and exhausted, but they were alive. Jack rode up, his face grim but relieved. "We lost a few," he said quietly, "but we made it." As the men worked to regroup and calm the herd, Mateo knelt by the water's edge, his brow furrowed. "Jack," he called, holding up a piece of driftwood. The men gathered around, their faces darkening as they saw the deep gouges in the wood, claw marks too large and too deliberate to be from any natural creature. Will stared at the marks, his stomach churning. "It followed us," he whispered. Jack's face was like stone as he mounted his horse. "Get the herd moving," he ordered. "We're not stopping until we're clear of this river." As the cattle plodded onward, the men couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the shadows of the distant trees. The Platte River had been a test of endurance, but the real danger was still out there, waiting. Chapter 7: Arrival at Fort Fetterman. The days following the harrowing Platte River crossing passed in an uneasy calm. The cattle settled into their routine, the men's nerves slowly unwinding with each mile. The endless plains stretched ahead, the horizon shimmering in the afternoon heat. For Will, the quiet was almost worse than the chaos. Every rustle of wind through the grass made him jump. Every distant shadow had him gripping the butt of his revolver. He wasn't the only one. The men avoided talking about the mutilated cattle, the claw marks, and the creature's glowing eyes, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud over their camp. By the time they reached the site of Fort Fetterman, they were relieved to see even a semblance of civilization, even if the fort itself was little more than an abandoned shell. Fort Fetterman, once a bustling frontier post, had been closed for years. The buildings were weathered and sagging, their once proud walls now marked by decay. The wind howled through the empty windows, carrying the faint scent of rotting wood. "It's eerie," Mateo muttered as they rode into the fort's crumbling courtyard. "Better than camping in the open," Jack said, though even he seemed uneasy. "We'll use what shelter we can. Get the herd settled just outside the walls and keep a close watch." The men worked quickly, securing the cattle in a makeshift corral and setting up camp in what remained of the old barracks. The walls offered some protection from the elements, but their hollow silence was unnerving. While exploring the fort, Jed stumbled upon something unusual in the officers' quarters: a journal, its leather cover worn but intact. He dusted it off and flipped through the yellowed pages, his brow furrowing as he skimmed the entries. "What did you find?" Will asked, peering over his shoulder. Jed held up the journal, his expression grim. "Looks like it belonged to one of the officers stationed here before they shut the place down." Will glanced at the scrawled handwriting. "Anything useful?" Jed nodded slowly. "More than I'd like. Listen to this." He read aloud. June 14th, 1876. Another patrol reported strange tracks in the forest west of the fort. Larger than any bear I've ever seen. The men are on edge, claiming it's the hairy man the Lakota speak of. I dismissed it as superstition until I saw the tracks myself. June 21st, 1876. We've lost 3 cattle from the fort's stock. The carcasses were found mutilated as if by massive claws. The men are scared, and I can't blame them. June 28th, 1876. The howls started again last night. Low, guttural, and too close for comfort. I've posted extra guards, but morale is crumbling. I fear whatever is out there isn't just an animal. Fort Fetterman marked the edge of the plains and the gateway to the towering Bighorn Mountains. Beyond the fort, the trail would climb into rugged terrain, where narrow passes and dense forests would make herding cattle an even greater challenge. For Jack and his crew, the looming peaks were both a promise of progress and a harbinger of danger. The men worked tirelessly to regroup after their night at the fort, knowing it would be the last semblance of shelter for days. Supplies were checked and double-checked, the cattle were counted, and the horses were rested. Yet, a heavy unease hung over the group. "We're heading into its territory," Jed muttered to Mateo as they loaded the wagons. "The journal said the tracks came from the west. That means the mountains." Mateo nodded grimly. "We've seen what it can do in open country. Imagine what it'll be like up there." Chapter 8. Into the Bighorns. The trail climbed steadily into the mountains, the landscape shifting from rolling plains to steep inclines and thick forests. The air grew cooler, and the sound of the wind through the pines was both soothing and ominous. The crew moved cautiously, knowing that every turn of the trail could hide danger. Jack rode at the front, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain. "Keep the herd tight," he called back to the others, "and stay close to the trail. These slopes are treacherous enough without losing cattle to a fall." The first few days in the mountains were uneventful, but the sense of being watched never left them. The forests were alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, but every so often there was something else, a low, guttural growl, a heavy thud of footsteps. Will glanced over his shoulder more than once, his rifle always within reach. "It's out there," he whispered to Hank one evening as they tended the fire. "I can feel it." Hank nodded, his face pale in the firelight. "We all can." On the 4th morning in the mountains, the men awoke to find one of the steers missing. The makeshift corral was intact, with no sign of a break, but the steer was gone. Mateo found the tracks first, leading away from the herd and into the dense forest. They were the same massive, clawed prints they'd seen before. "It took one right out from under us," Mateo said, his voice tight with anger and fear. Jack crouched by the tracks, his face grim. "It's testing us again, seeing how close it can get." Jed shifted nervously. "This thing isn't just a predator, it's smart, smarter than it ought to be." Jack stood, his expression hard. "We stay together. No one goes anywhere alone. If it wants a fight, it'll get one." That night, the men camped in a narrow valley, surrounded by towering pines. The firelight barely penetrated the darkness, and the forest seemed to close in around them. The howls started again, echoing through the trees and sending shivers down the spines of even the bravest cowboys. This time they were closer, more insistent. The cattle stirred restlessly, their lowing growing louder with each howl. "Load up," Jack ordered, his voice firm but low. The men obeyed, their rifles and pistols ready. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the edge of the camp. A tree toppled as if by some immense force. The men jumped to their feet, their weapons trained on the darkness. "What the hell was that?" Will whispered, his voice trembling. The answer came in the form of a deep, guttural growl, so close it seemed to reverberate through the ground. A shadow moved just beyond the firelight, massive and hulking, with eyes that glowed faintly red. Jack raised his rifle, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. "Show yourself, damn it!" The creature didn't respond, but the growl deepened, a sound that seemed to carry both a warning and a challenge. Then, Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone, melting back into the forest. The first rays of dawn brought no relief. The camp, nestled in the narrow valley, was eerily silent save for the occasional snort from the cattle. Jack stirred from his bedroll, his back aching from another restless night. As he stood and stretched, he noticed something was off. One of the horses was loose, its reins dragging in the dirt. "Jed," Jack called, his voice low but urgent. "Where's Will?" Jed sat up, rubbing his eyes. He scanned the camp, his expression shifting from groggy to alarmed. He was on watch last night. The rest of the crew quickly roused, their voices overlapping with concern. Mateo checked Will's bedroll. It was untouched, and his rifle was gone. "He wouldn't just wander off," Mateo said, his voice tight. "Not after what we've seen." Jack's stomach twisted as he glanced at the edge of the camp, where the ground was soft from the night's drizzle. There, clear in the mud, were two sets of tracks. One human, leading toward the forest, and another, massive and clawed, following close behind. "We're not leaving him out there," Jack said firmly, buckling his gun belt. Mateo nodded. "We'll take the horses and split up, cover as much ground as we can before the trail gets cold." Jed frowned, his hand resting on his revolver. "What if it's too late?" Jack's eyes hardened. "We don't stop until we know." The men divided into pairs, following the tracks into the dense forest. The trees loomed tall and close, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the morning light. The ground was littered with fallen leaves and broken twigs, the silence broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of the wind. Mateo and Hank were the first to find something, a patch of ground where the leaves were disturbed, as if by a struggle. Nearby, Will's rifle lay discarded, its barrel streaked with mud. "He put up a fight," Hank said quietly, picking up the weapon. "But against what?" Mateo replied, his voice barely a whisper. Jack and Jed arrived moments later, their expressions grim as they took in the scene. Jack knelt by the ground, running his fingers over a jagged gouge in the earth. "It dragged him," he said, pointing to a set of claw marks that led deeper into the forest. Jed swallowed hard. "If it wanted him dead, it would have finished him here. Why take him?" No one answered. The question hung in the air like a dark cloud as they followed the trail. As the sun climbed higher, the forest seemed to grow darker, the trees pressing in closer with every step. The trail wound through narrow ravines and over rocky outcroppings, always leading upward. Then, a howl split the air. It was long, guttural, and impossibly close. The horses spooked, their ears flattening and their eyes rolling with fear. Mateo struggled to keep his mount steady, his voice trembling. "It's toying with us." Jack raised a hand, signaling for silence. The men froze, their breaths shallow as they listened. The howl came again, this time from another direction, as if the creature were circling them. "Stay sharp," Jack muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. "And don't split up." The trail ended in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. In the center of the clearing was what remained of a makeshift campsite. A fire pit smoldered faintly, its embers still warm. Scattered around were bits of Will's belongings, his hat, his canteen, and a torn scrap of his shirt. Mateo picked up the shirt, his face pale. He was here, not long ago. Then Jed spotted something near the edge of the clearing, a tree trunk, splintered and clawed. Etched into the bark, as if by massive fingers, was a crude mark, a symbol, or perhaps a warning. "What the hell is that?" Jed asked, his voice barely audible. Jack stared at the mark, his jaw clenched. "It's a message," he said quietly. "It wants us to know it's watching, and it's not done." The men returned to camp as the sun dipped below the horizon, their hope fading with the light. Will was still missing, and the sense of dread had deepened into something almost unbearable. That night, the howls came again, louder and more insistent. The creature didn't stay hidden this time. Shadowy glimpses of its massive form appeared at the edges of the firelight, its glowing eyes reflecting the flames. The cattle panicked, pressing against the makeshift corral and nearly breaking free. The men stood their ground, their rifles trained on the darkness, but none dared to fire. "Jack," Mateo whispered, his voice shaking. "If we stay here, none of us are getting out alive." Jack nodded slowly, his face grim. "At first light we move. We're getting these cattle and ourselves out of this cursed place." As the creature's growls echoed through the night, the men knew that the Bighorn Mountains held more than just rugged trails and wild beauty. Something ancient and malevolent hunted those who dared to trespass, and it wasn't going to let them go without a fight. Chapter 1. The Search for Will. The first light of dawn found the men somber and determined. Jack gathered the group near the smoldering remnants of the campfire, his voice low but steady. "We're not leaving Will behind," he said, looking each of them in the eye. "We've faced rustlers, storms, and stampedes. This is no different. We stick together, and we bring him back." The men nodded, though fear flickered in their eyes. Armed with rifles, ropes, and torches, they retraced the clawed tracks leading from the clearing where Will had been dragged away. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath, the towering pines casting long shadows over the damp ground. The tracks led them deeper into the mountains, winding through narrow ravines and over jagged rocks. The creature's movements were deliberate, as if it knew the terrain intimately. The claw marks on the trees and gouges in the earth grew more erratic, suggesting a struggle. "He fought back," Mateo said, pointing to a patch of churned-up dirt and broken branches. "But it was too strong." Jed said, "If he's alive, why hasn't it killed him?" Jack didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the trail, his jaw tight. He wasn't ready to consider the worst, not yet. By mid-morning, the trail crested a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. The air was colder here, the trees thicker, their gnarled roots twisting over mossy rocks. As the men paused to catch their breath, a faint sound reached them, a voice. "Help! Someone! Please!" Jack's heart leapt. "That's Will," he hissed, motioning for the others to stay quiet. They followed the voice, pushing through dense underbrush until they came upon a small cave nestled at the base of a cliff. Inside, the faint flicker of movement caught their eye. "Will!" Jack called softly, stepping forward with his rifle raised. A groan came from within, weak but unmistakably human. "Jack, over here." The men rushed inside, their torches lighting up the cave's dark recesses. Will was there, slumped against the wall, his shirt torn and his face pale. Blood matted his hair and claw marks raked his arms, but he was alive. Jack dropped to his knees beside him. "You're safe now, Will. We've got you." Will's eyes darted to the cave entrance. It's still out there," he whispered. "It dragged me here like I was nothing. I thought it was going to kill me, but it just watched, like it was deciding what to do." "Why let you go?" Jed asked. His voice hushed. Will shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe it wanted me to warn you. Maybe it's playing with us." As they helped Will to his feet, a deafening roar echoed from the cave entrance. The ground seemed to shake as the massive silhouette of the creature appeared, its glowing red eyes glaring at them. "Move," Jack barked, firing a shot that ricocheted off the cave walls. The men scrambled, dragging Will between them as the creature charged. Its hulking form blocked the entrance, forcing them to retreat deeper into the cave. "It's got us cornered," Mateo shouted, raising his rifle. "Light the torches," Jack ordered. "It hates fire." The men thrust their torches forward, the flames casting flickering light over the creature's grotesque features. Long, matted fur, massive claws, and a face that was almost human but distorted with rage. The creature roared again, but it hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing against the bright flames. Taking advantage of its hesitation, Jack fired a well-aimed shot at the ground near its feet, sending sparks flying. "Go! Now!" he yelled. The men charged past the creature, their torches held high. It swiped at them, its claws grazing Mateo's arm, but they didn't stop. Once outside, they ran, half dragging Will down the rocky slope. Behind them, the creature let out a final, earth-shaking roar before retreating into the cave. "Keep moving," Jack urged, his heart pounding as they plunged back into the forest. By the time they reached camp, the sun was high, casting warm light over the valley. The men collapsed by the fire, their breaths ragged. Will sat propped against a log, his face still pale, but his expression determined. "We have to get out of these mountains," he said. "That thing's not done with us." Jack nodded. "We'll move at first light, but tonight we keep the fire high, and no one goes anywhere alone." The men agreed, their fear tempered by relief. They had rescued Will, but the knowledge of the creature's intelligence and strength weighed heavily on them. Chapter N. The Sudden Attack. The cattle shifted uneasily in their corral, lowing nervously at every snap of a twig. The men stayed close to the fire, their rifles within arm's reach, and their eyes scanning the forest. Jack stood watch, his shoulders tense. The others tried to rest, but sleep was impossible. They all knew the creature was out there, biding its time. A low growl shattered the silence, coming from the darkness just beyond the firelight. Jack raised his rifle, his voice sharp. "It's here." The growl grew louder, closer, and then chaos. The creature charged into the camp, its massive form illuminated by the fire. It moved with terrifying speed, scattering the cattle and crashing through their makeshift barriers. "Hold your ground," Jack shouted, firing a shot. The bullet hit the creature in the shoulder, but it barely flinched. The men scrambled, grabbing their weapons and forming a loose circle around the fire. The creature swiped at the nearest wagon, smashing it to splinters and sending supplies flying. Mateo lit a torch, swinging it toward the creature. The flames made it pause, its glowing eyes narrowing in rage. "Drive it back!" Jack yelled, grabbing another torch and thrusting it forward. The creature let out a deafening roar, shaking the ground beneath their feet. It lashed out, knocking Jed off his feet and sending his rifle skidding into the dirt. "Jed!" Mateo lunged forward, grabbing his friend by the arm and dragging him back. The creature advanced, its movements almost calculated. It wasn't just attacking, it was testing them, pushing them toward the edge of the clearing where the firelight dimmed. "Stay together!" Jack barked, stepping in front of the others. He fired another shot, this time grazing the creature's leg. It let out a guttural snarl, retreating slightly, but still circling them like a predator sizing up its prey. Jack realized they couldn't keep retreating. The creature wasn't going to stop until they were all dead, or it was. "We end this now," Jack said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. "Mateo, grab the dynamite from the supply wagon. We'll set a trap." Mateo nodded, dashing toward the wrecked wagon. The creature lunged after him, but Hank and Jed fired in unison, their bullets striking its chest and momentarily stunning it. Mateo returned with the dynamite, his hands shaking as he handed it to Jack. "What's the plan?" Jack quickly tied the sticks together, attaching a short fuse. "We lure it in close, then light this and throw it. When it goes off, it's not getting back up." The men spread out, using the fire to keep the creature at bay as Jack readied the dynamite. The creature's growls filled the night, its red eyes flickering with a primal fury. "Over here!" Jack shouted, waving a torch to get its attention. The creature charged, its massive form crashing through the camp. Jack lit the fuse, his heart pounding as the sparks hissed and crackled. "Now!" he yelled, tossing the dynamite toward the creature. Time seemed to slow as the dynamite hit the ground near the creature's feet. For a moment, it hesitated, sniffing at the strange object. Then, boom! The explosion rocked the clearing, the fireball lighting up the night. The creature let out a blood-curdling roar, its massive form thrown back by the force. When the smoke cleared, the men cautiously approached the smoldering crater where the creature had fallen. Its body lay still, its fur singed and matted with blood. The glowing red eyes were finally dim, its monstrous form lifeless. Jack exhaled, lowering his rifle. It's over. The men stood in stunned silence, their faces pale and their breaths ragged. Jed knelt beside the creature, his hands trembling. What the hell was this thing? Mateo shook his head. Something that doesn't belong in this world. As dawn broke, the men packed up what little they could salvage and prepared to leave the mountains. The cattle, miraculously, had mostly survived the attack, though they were skittish and difficult to manage. Jack looked back at the clearing one last time, the charred ground and shattered trees, a stark reminder of their ordeal. Let's move, he said. The sooner we're out of these mountains, the better. The trail ahead was long and uncertain, but they carried with them a hard-earned lesson. Some things in the wild were more than just legend, and some battles left scars that would never fully heal. As they drove the herd down the mountain, none of them spoke of the creature again, but they all knew its memory would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Chapter 12, Pressing Onward. The morning air was crisp, the peaks of the Bighorn Mountains shrouded in mist as the men resumed the cattle drive. Despite their victory over the hairy man, a heavy silence hung over the group. The men's faces were pale and drawn, their focus entirely on the task at hand. Each creak of a saddle, each restless low from the cattle, seemed magnified in the stillness. Jack rode ahead, his sharp eyes scanning the rugged trail. The hairy man was gone, but the mountains had their own dangers: treacherous cliffs, unpredictable weather, and predators that could spook the herd into a deadly stampede. "We keep moving," he called over his shoulder. "The faster we're out of these mountains, the better." The others nodded, their hands tight on the reins. The herd of 2,100 cattle shuffled forward, their hooves kicking up dust on the narrow, rocky trail. By midday, the group reached a choke point in the trail, a narrow pass bordered by steep cliffs on one side and a sheer drop on the other. The ground was loose and uneven, and the cattle balked, their instincts warning them of the danger. "This is going to be tricky," Mateo said, dismounting to steady his horse. Jack dismounted as well, taking the lead. "Jed, Mateo, flank the herd. Keep them calm. Hank, take the rear and watch for stragglers." The men fell into position, their movements slow and deliberate. The lead cattle hesitated, their hooves scraping against the rocky ground. "Easy now," Jack murmured, guiding the first steer onto the narrow trail. The herd began to follow, their progress painstakingly slow. The sound of loose rocks tumbling down the cliffside set everyone's nerves on edge. Halfway through the pass, a distant rumble echoed through the mountains. Jack froze, his heart pounding as the sound grew louder. "Rock slide!" Mateo shouted. A section of the cliff above them began to crumble, sending a cascade of boulders and debris tumbling toward the trail. The cattle panicked, their terrified bellows filling the air. "Move!" Jack yelled, waving his arms to spur the herd forward. The men scrambled to control the chaos, their shouts barely audible over the noise. Jed rode alongside the herd, slapping his reins against the cattle to drive them forward. "Keep them together," Hank yelled, his horse dancing nervously beneath him. The rockslide missed the herd by a hair, the boulders crashing onto the trail behind them and sending a cloud of dust into the air. The men coughed and squinted, their hearts racing. When the dust settled, Jack turned back to assess the damage. A large section of the trail was completely blocked, the way they'd come now impassable. "No going back now," Mateo said, his voice grim. Jack nodded. "Then we keep moving. Double-check the herd. Make sure we didn't lose any cattle in the panic." As the afternoon wore on, dark clouds gathered over the peaks, and the air grew heavy with the promise of rain. Jack glanced at the sky, his brow furrowed. "Storm's coming. We need to find shelter." The trail widened into a small rocky plateau where they could regroup. As the first drops of rain fell, the men worked quickly to secure the herd, tying ropes between trees to keep the cattle from scattering. The storm hit hard, sheets of rain pelting the men and cattle alike. Lightning lit up the mountains, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that spooked the herd. "Hold them steady," Jack shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. Mateo and Jed fought to calm the cattle, their horses slipping on the rain-slick ground. The storm raged for what felt like hours, the men soaked to the bone and exhausted. When the storm finally passed, the men regrouped, their clothes and spirits dampened. The trail ahead was now a muddy mess, and the swollen creeks posed a new challenge. As they prepared to move on, Jed noticed something unusual, large tracks in the mud circling the edge of their camp. "These aren't from the hairy man," Jed said, kneeling to inspect the prints. "Too small for that, but big enough to worry about." "Wolves," Mateo said grimly, "or a mountain lion." Jack's jaw tightened. "Whatever it is, it's watching us. We'll need to keep the herd close and stay sharp. No more surprises." The group pressed on, the tension palpable. Each night they took turns standing watch, their rifles at the ready. The trail became steeper and more dangerous as they climbed higher, the air thinning and the temperatures dropping. But the men didn't falter. The memory of the hairy man still lingered, a reminder of what they'd already overcome. By the time they reached the western slope of the Bighorn Mountains, the sight of the open plains beyond filled them with renewed hope. The worst was behind them, or so they thought. Chapter 12. The Journey to Bozeman. The descent from the Bighorn Mountains into the sprawling valley was a bittersweet relief. The men, weary from the trials of the mountains, breathed easier as the trail leveled out and the trees gave way to rolling plains. Snow-capped peaks loomed behind them, a reminder of the dangers they'd faced and survived. The valley before them stretched wide, golden in the afternoon sun, dotted with sagebrush and crisscrossed by ribbons of sparkling streams. Somewhere in the distance lay Bozeman, their final waypoint before delivering the herd to Montana's rich grazing lands. Jack pulled his horse to a halt and turned to the others. "We're close, boys. Let's keep the herd moving steady. We've come too far to lose any cattle now." The men felt the tension begin to ease as they guided the herd through the lush valley. The grasses were tall and green, offering the cattle ample grazing, and the warm sun seemed to rejuvenate both man and beast. Mateo rode alongside Jack, his face still lined with exhaustion but softer now. "Feels strange, doesn't it? All this open space after those tight trails in the mountains." Jack nodded. "It does, but we can't get too comfortable. There's still work to be done." The valley had its own set of challenges. Streams swollen from the spring thaw crisscrossed their path, and the herd had to be carefully managed to prevent stragglers or panicked cattle from being swept away. At one point, a particularly deep creek posed a problem. The men worked together, creating a makeshift ford with logs and stones to guide the herd across. It was slow, grueling work, but they managed without losing a single steer. "That's teamwork," Jed said with a tired grin as they finished. "We're a damn fine crew." As the days passed, they began to see signs of civilization. A lone cabin here, a distant plume of smoke there. It wasn't long before they came across a rough dirt road, leading them to a small settlement on the outskirts of Bozeman. The sight of the town was a welcome relief. The men exchanged tired but triumphant smiles as they approached, the sound of the herd's lowing blending with the distant hum of a bustling frontier town. Bozeman was a lively place, its streets bustling with traders, ranchers, and settlers. Word of the cattle drive had preceded them, and the townsfolk greeted the group warmly. A local rancher named Mr. Thompson approached Jack, tipping his wide-brimmed hat. "You're the ones driving that herd all the way from Texas? Heard you had a hell of a time in the mountains." Jack nodded, shaking the man's hand. "We did, but we made it through. Cattle are still in good shape, too." "Well, you've got my respect," Thompson said. "Not many can say they've crossed the Bighorns with a herd that size." The men finally had a chance to relax. spending a few days in Bozeman to restock supplies, repair gear, and enjoy the simple pleasures of civilization. For Will, who was still recovering from his ordeal in the mountains, the time was especially valuable. "Feels good to be on solid ground again," he said, raising a mug of beer in the saloon. "To survival," Mateo said, clinking his mug against Will's, "and to never seeing those mountains again." Refreshed and reinvigorated, the group prepared for the last leg of their journey to the ranch lands outside Bozeman. As they mounted their horses and began driving the cattle out of town, Jack looked back at the town and the mountains beyond. They had faced storms, predators, and a legendary beast, but they had survived. The trail had tested them, shaped them, and bonded them in ways they never expected. "Let's get these cattle home," Jack said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The others echoed his sentiment with cheers, their spirits lifted. Together they drove the herd into the vast Montana plains, the promise of success finally within reach. Chapter 13: The Herd in Montana. The sun hung low on the horizon as Jack and the men guided the herd into the vast, rolling fields of Montana. The open plains stretched endlessly before them, bordered by distant mountains still capped with snow, their jagged peaks barely visible in the twilight. After a long, perilous journey from the heat of Texas to the cold, craggy Bighorns, the men had arrived at the ranch lands outside Bozeman. Their mission was finally complete, and the herd had made it. The cattle, a mix of hardy longhorns and sturdy breeds suited to the harsh Montana winters, grazed contentedly in the lush grasses. The men had made it to a large ranch owned by a well-established cattle baron, Mr. Thompson, who had welcomed them with open arms. "This is it," Jack said, his voice filled with both pride and relief as he surveyed the scene. "Home," Mateo added, his eyes scanning the horizon, taking in the beauty of the land they had worked so hard to reach. "Sure feels different, don't it?" Jed said, riding up alongside them. "The air's cleaner, and there's no more worry about landslides or creepy creatures lurking around." Jack chuckled, giving his horse a gentle nudge. "Feels like we've earned it, every step of the way." The men had set up camp near the ranch's new, sturdy fencing, where they could rest the cattle while arrangements were made for their final branding and sale. The early evening settled into quiet calm. The only sounds, the distant lowing of the cattle and the soft whisper of the wind moving through the tall grasses. As they sat around the fire that night, the crackling flames casting shadows over their faces, each man had his own thoughts about the journey. For some, it was about the trials they'd survived, the wild storms, the treacherous mountain passes, the eerie terror of the hairy man, and the rugged solitude of the wilderness. For others, it was about the work that lay ahead, setting up ranches, building fences, and living off the land in a new raw frontier. But for all of them, there was a shared understanding. They had forged an unbreakable bond. They were survivors, each having faced their fears and challenges, each having contributed to the success of this incredible journey. "We did it," Will said, his voice quiet but filled with satisfaction. "All the way from Texas to Montana. I'm proud of this." "Proud of you too," Jack replied, clapping his friend on the back. "We're a good crew." As the fire burned down to embers, the men sat in silence for a while, listening to the night. The stars above were clear, bright pinpricks in a velvet sky, far removed from the dangers they had faced in the mountains. They had made it. Their cattle were safe, the land was fertile, and the work ahead would be grueling but rewarding. Jack gazed out toward the horizon, the silhouettes of mountains fading into the dark. "Tomorrow, we start building, but for tonight, let's just enjoy it." The others nodded in agreement. It had been a long journey, one filled with hardship, fear, and moments of pure adrenaline, but in the end, they had made it. The cattle drive was over, and Montana had become home. The sound of the fire crackling, the cattle settling in the fields and the cool night air wrapped around them like a blanket as they watched the stars, their journey now a part of the vast, untamed landscape of the West. And in that moment, they knew that whatever the future held, they had already survived the hardest part. The adventure was over, the herd was established, and Montana, for better or worse, was now their home. The end. Thanks so much from Cryptid Monologues for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss an update. And hey, while you're here, check out these videos. You'll definitely love them. See you in the next one.